All right, so like the slide says, let me move my little guys here on my end. Okay, hopefully that's good enough. Yeah, just going to be talking about history of AI and neuroscience, and hopefully touch on some points that maybe I would make the case artificial intelligence practitioners like us should take some of these ideas from neuroscience that have been coming out in the last couple decades. Okay, so here's Mark Rosenflat's original Perceptron from 1958. This was hardware. You know, we probably all of us learned about it as maybe software. This was the ancestor of today's artificial neural networks, and it was inspired by theoretical neuroscience at that time. And he actually went on to become a professor at Cornell in neurobiology. So this guy really knew his stuff. Fast forward a couple decades, I'm going to butcher this, but I'll try. Funihiko Fukushima's neocognitron. This was also heavily inspired by neuroscience, in particular Hubel and Wiesel's model of visual cortex processing. These guys are going to come up a couple times. They've inspired this field in a couple different ways. This model of visual cortex processing, I think it was like in the 50s and 60s. They figured this stuff out from anesthetized cats. So they'd pump these cats up with drugs, hold their head and their eyes still, and then have a projector, and they'd move certain what we call like low-level features onto the projector. So simple circles, some lines at different orientations, and they found that some of these neurons hooked up almost direct, the lower level neurons in the neocortex, the visual neocortex, responded to these low-level features. And so they postulated, okay, some of these neurons are doing this. Maybe later on in processing, these lower-level features get combined, right? And this should sound like convolutional neural networks because this is exactly what inspired them. Even though Jan LeCun will get all the credit, he pretty much added backprop 9 years later. And also downsampling layers in addition to convolutional layers were made in this neocognitron paper. And I know it seemed like SIFT. This is also the same work that inspired SIFT, these neuroscience guys. And then, where are we at today? We're almost a decade in the latest AI summer. AlexNet, arguably the biggest software change was just like an activation layer change. We went from sigmoids to ReLUs, and convergence happened a lot quicker in training. And then, this is debatable, but I would make the case that the majority of the drive of this last summer has been probably more hardware. So nowadays we've got bigger compute with GPUs, and we've got bigger data. And I'll make this point a couple times throughout this presentation, but like there are a lot of things that are enough. Like, Rich Sutton recently would say RL is enough. Schmidt-Huber would tell you logical theorem proving is enough. Evolutionary algorithms are obviously enough because we're here, but a lot of these will require unrealistic compute. So, take it with a grain of salt would be my point. So the history of the relationship between neuroscience and AI is we've got a lot of inspiration already from neuroscience. And maybe it's time to do something orthogonal to what we've been doing this last decade and continue to look at the field of neuroscience for solutions to all these hard problems I got listed here. I've worked on a bunch of these. I know a lot of you listening have probably worked on a lot of these as well. Generalizing beyond the training distribution, few-shot learning, catastrophic forgetting, continuous learning, sensor fusion. I've worked on this one for GFR because we had a LiDAR and a camera. How do you make a neural network architecture that can actually do better than either of them independently can? And Tesla, with their AI stack for self-driving, has actually even just given up on this. They've gone full RGB recently. I don't think Anant's in here, but shout out to Anant. Adversarial robustness is obviously a problem. Here's my other hardware jab, right? NLP models don't seem to be reasoning over knowledge the way we have them now. They seem to be statistical tricks. some people with like going from GPT-2 to GPT-3, were holding their breath that this would become emergent when you just throw more compute at it. That doesn't seem to be the case. People have been holding their breath since the 80s for this kind of emergent phenomena. And then this last point is probably the weakest, right? I don't know. This seems like maybe the hardest. Interpretability of these really complicated systems. Debugging them is going to be inherently hard, but it is easier for me to build trust in you guys than it is for me to build trust in like recurrent neural networks nowadays and stuff like that, I think. And so why am I talking about the brain? I've got a background. I've got a biology degree from here at OSU with a minor in chemistry because I was going for pre-med. In preparation for medical school, I was also reading like neuroscience textbooks they teach. And so I've got a little bit of a background in this, and I came across a podcast with this guy who wrote this book recently, 1,000 Brains, A New Theory of Intelligence. So this is Jeff Hawkins. He's a neuroscience guy. You might know him from, he was the dude who made Palm Pilots. That's kind of his side project. He was telling investors at the time, like, I'm not going to do this for long. I'm going to go back to my baby. I'm going to go back to neuroscience. And he made enough money from that for the last 15 years, he's been around Berkeley funding labs into theoretical neuroscience. And this book shows a lot of that journey, a lot of the discoveries he claims to have made with that group. Specifically, it's a theory on the neocortex, so the biggest part of our brain, and it does almost everything we pretty much label as intelligence. To build a little more credibility, if you don't know who Jeff is, the foreword was written by Richard Dawkins, who had a lot of nice things to say about the book. As a biologist, like, he's just a living legend in evolutionary theory. So that built credibility for me. He also was on like the Lex Friedman podcast, but more importantly to me, he was on the Sam Harris podcast. He has a PhD in neuroscience, and he raised no red flags whenever any of these neuroscience topics were brought up. So that, yet again, just built a little bit of credibility for Jeff. And then Jeffrey Hinton, I guess a couple years ago, had said that maybe we should look to the brain for some of these problems, right? The same message I was saying earlier. And you'll actually find his capsule nets have a lot of overlapping ideas with the ideas presented in this book. So if you don't look up Jeff Hawkins, it's outside your wheelhouse, maybe look up capsule nets. So quick crash course, this book's about the neocortex and how it produces intelligence. What is the neocortex? It's about 200 million years old, and it is only evolved in mammals. And humans have like the largest relative amount of their brain as neocortex. It accounts for 70% of the volume when you include the white matter, which is support cellular. It's not doing any of the processing. It's like keeping it fed and providing structure and stuff like that. And I already said it does almost everything we care about. Arguably, some motor behavior is really intelligent that we care about that's not done by this part of the brain because it doesn't actually directly control motor behavior. It has a talk with the old part of the brain, and then that part of the brain will control the way we move. So what's Jeff's theory replacing? It's kind of a superset of this old idea, the same ideas I already talked about that inspired convolutional neural networks. These ideas have kind of already been in contention for a couple decades. And some of these points I'm going to say are actually probably pretty obvious to us since we study intelligence, even if it's not biologically inspired. So like the existing view is like convolutional neural networks even without the recurrence. So I find that kind of absurd. I think recurrence will be necessary, especially like feedback. And if you think of like a regular convolutional neural network, and you got these low-level features and these high-level features, it seems intuitive to me that there's the combinatorial like explosion of these lower-level features being combined, that there'd actually be a lot more unique macro-size objects than there are low-level features. And that's not what we see in the brain. We actually see at the lower-level features, there's a lot more neural substrate than there are in the higher-level features. And this imbalance is even worse in things like mice. So this old view of intelligence doesn't really account for that. And then also these low-level features can predict what's going to come next into the sensory input stream. I think most of us, yet again, would just reach for recurrence to explain this, but these theories that are still prevailing today from the 50s and 60s didn't account for this. And then Hubel and Wiesel with their cats that inspired the convolutional neural networks. They had those cats just kind of held down and showing them stuff. They could only explain what a couple of these neurons, a small percentage of the neurons were actually doing in these lower layers of the visual cortex processing. The modern theory I keep referencing doesn't explain what the majority of neurons do. Okay, so I've got the preamble done, hopefully, and we can get to the first exciting point that I think maybe we should care about. And that's that the way we model artificial neural networks today are missing 90% of the connections in the brain. We just don't model now. And there's a reason for that, because they weren't even discovered until the 90s. And these connections will lead to what are called Gendritic Spikes. And these spikes will occur outside this green area here on these dendrites. So these are kind of inputs. You would expect inputs to arrive here. And what we model nowadays in like our point neurons are the connections that connect kind of in this green region. So patterns that appear in these green regions on the dendrites are actually strong enough to cause an axon spike. And that's the type we classically model. But if you have input patterns over here, right, further away from the cell body, you don't get an axon spike. Well, what you'll get is kind of like it's a slight depolarization of the cell. You get a slight voltage change, but it doesn't cause an axon spike. And so we discovered these dendritic spikes in the 90s, and we didn't even figure out till later what they do. And what they do is the second point, right? Dendritic spikes prime the neuron to fire earlier than its neighbors when encountering patterns on inputs at the proximal dendrites. This also suppresses neighboring cells, and it induces sparsity. So it's kind of like all the neurons around this guy. Probably they're going to fire to the same pattern, and they're all going to race to the pattern. So it's this, when these dendritic spikes happen, it's kind of like one of these neurons has been told to get ready, get set, and now it's ready to run and beat everybody off the line. And all of its neighbors, notice this one neuron's going to fire first, and it's just going to give up, and they're going to save their energy for the next race, right? This is kind of just a loose analogy to give you some intuition. It's worth pointing out that probably any theory of intelligence that's going to be inspired by the brain needs to account for 90% of the neurons, in part because of the extreme evolutionary pressure to be efficient in the brain. And then Jeff says that these dendritic spikes are actually making unconscious predictions inside neurons. And that's what these are actually do, is that these connections further away from the cell body are noticing patterns and priming the cell to fire early and induce sparsity. They're kind of predicting what's going to be seen in a second. So as an example, I was watching a TV show with my friends like yesterday. I don't know if everybody knows what Whose Line Is It Anyway is, but it's like a stand-up improv comedy show. And I was looking at my friend while they were looking at the TV, and they go, "Oh, Stephen Colbert is on TV." And I turned to the TV, and they'd already turned away from Stephen. I didn't see him. And so my brain was already making predictions based on what I know about Stephen Colbert. And I didn't even realize it until they showed him, and I went, "Oh, this show is 20 years old. This is a very young Stephen Colbert." So I wouldn't even realize, in a lot of these predictions, you don't even realize are happening because they're happening inside the neurons, and they're not causing mass excitation or neuronal activity until something goes wrong. And instead of the one set neuron firing when the prediction's correct, you actually get a lot more activity when those predictions are wrong. And that's an empirical fact we've known about. Okay, so I kind of talked about sparsity's nice, and that's good for robustness. You can knock out like 30% of the neurons and still get reliable performance. And then the other thing was, sorry, is this going to let me do stuff? Yeah, these dendritic spikes, a whole bunch of the connections doing predictions inside neurons. And then this third thing I want to introduce is this common cortical circuit, these columns, as they're called. And the idea here is that there is some subcircuit that is kind of used in almost everything intelligent we do, that probably existed in like the old brain, and that was adapted for the new brain, and then we made a lot of them through like genetic mutation. And that it matters more of the senses, in the sense what you kind of hook up to these common algorithms, these common little circuits, to produce different like behaviors of intelligence, like processing vision, processing auditorial stuff, touch, etc. And this was originally proposed by Vernon Mountcastle in 1978. Part of the inspiration for him coming up with this is, sure, if you look under a microscope, there are differences in different parts of the neocortex, but it's more striking actually how just similar they are. And there'd be about 150,000 of these cortical columns in humans. And this was confirmed by those same guys that did the cat experiments, Hubel and Wiesel, but using monkeys instead. And to gain some more intuition that like there's this subcircuit probably somewhere in the brain that does a lot of what we care about as intelligence, is this guy here, Phineas Gage, which if you guys haven't heard of him, I'm excited to share him with you. He was like a really dependable like guy in his young 20s working on the railroad around the turn of the century, around 1900. And there was an accident, and this thing he's holding, right, this big iron rod, got shot through his eye and scrambled the prefrontal cortex up here and shot out. And he lived, but he obviously had huge planning deficits and behavioral changes. Like his friends said he was a completely different guy from then on out. They didn't recognize him. And he was no longer a dependable railroad foreman, as you'd expect. But over time, many years, because he was older, not as neuroplastic as children, he was able to gain back some of that functionality. And if you presuppose that the prefrontal cortex is the only part of the brain that can do that planning, then you're going to have a hard time explaining why he was able to recover some of his functionality. And if you look at people who are born blind, children, they kind of have a similar type of thing going on. So if you're normal, this is the way usually the genes would wire your brain and your sensory information up in your brain. And you've got vision. This green stuff is like touch, like temperature, pain. And then this purple stuff is going to be auditory processing. And you can see if you're blind, the blue bits for vision you don't really need, and the brain will automatically repurpose these bits of the brain to do other things that you are getting actual input from. And this is another thing, if this part of the brain for vision is purpose-built, how can it be useful for these other things and other processing that we need? I'm going to go check chat. Okay, I will look that up later, I promise. There's an evolutionary argument here to kind of be made. I'm going to gloss over this for time's sake. But, look at how long we've been evolving for 3,500 million years. And then in the last 7 of this hill climbing process where things are most often reused instead of, started de novo. This is just to say that we should look to old parts of the brain, the circuits that already existing in the new parts of the brain. It just seems more probable, but we could dive into that more. So the 3 things I've mentioned, the common cortical circuit underlying almost everything we care about intelligence, predictions about what the sensory input is going to be next, and induced sparsity. Just those things alone, they've shown in simulations, in addition to Hebbian learning, not backprop, that you can get some sequence memory. So like the Name That Tune game, you can do very similar to the way we would listen to the first couple beats of a song, and we don't know exactly what song it is, but we can list a couple probabilities. It doesn't matter if there's repetition in the song, we can have long-range dependencies. They've done this with the 3 things I've already mentioned. But that's only half the problem. We can predict, or they can predict what the artificial brain is going to see and its senses next when the world is changing. But what if you're the thing causing the change? What if you're moving? And for that, Jeff says that this movement-related signal they needed to explain predicting movement was reference frames. And so that's what this slide is. It's showing in the old brain where reference frames are done. In these first 2 points, place cells and grid cells, they received the Nobel Prize in like 2008. And they're essentially, the first is like a "you are here" marker. So there's some neuron in your brain that'll fire when you're at some specific location in your environment. And then grid cells kind of make a body-centric reference frame. And you can see these grid cells here. Always a little confused. Like, I guess you're supposed to see this pattern in here, but I never see it. And this, I think, will be maybe the last technical slide. So this is just what I was saying. Maybe these old reference frames and "you are here" markers were copied into the new brain, and that will allow you to not only name the tune, but also predict what you're going to see when you move around in your environment. And you can see here's these cortical columns. These are from the simulations he's done to prove that this is good. So they showed that 3 columns is better than 1, especially when you include lateral connections here and feedback connections. Let's see, which of these do I want to read? Yeah, I don't think they did that many. I can't recall exactly how many they did. But I guess I'll just read these to get the takeaway points, right? Is that the brain builds predictive models of the world by associating sensory input with locations in reference frames. And there's some little thought. The second point is more of just a thought experiment to show that this must be the case, right? If our perception is related to neuronal activity, the fact that we perceive objects as being somewhere, not in our ears and our eyes where we actually know they come to us, but instead we perceive them as some location in the world, tells us that the brain must have neurons whose activity represent the location of every object that we perceive. So we can debate about that, but it's a fun little maybe intuition builder. And here's the last slide. There was empirical evidence for the more speculative claim that Jeff makes. And he says not only is those reference frames good for visual processing or recognizing objects, but that he makes the claims that all knowledge is stored at location in reference frames, and that thinking is actually a form of movement through these reference frames. And there was this 2006 fMRI study that was shown, they essentially, those old parts of the brain that have all these reference frame stuff that he thinks is necessary, you can find their pattern of activity in fMRI statistically pretty well. And then they showed that they're in multiple places in the new parts of the brain as well. So you essentially see the same signature, and that signature gets stronger as you learn tasks that aren't even spatial, like this bird. So they would put people in these scanners. They had like 30 people, and they would show them a start bird, and they would use this controller on the left to change it into the goal bird. And as people learned, they scanned these people like immediately, 8 hours later, and like a week later, and consistently they could show that there was a strong correlation between these grid cells and place cells firing in the new parts of the brain and your efficiency at this task of being able to do this controller task on the bottom here. And then this last point, and I think we're done. Each object, this is where it gets the name, the 1,000 brain theory of intelligence, is that each object or concept is represented by thousands of models distributed throughout the brain. Each of these models would be like a cortical column, and the objects that it can recognize depends on the lateral, the feedback connections, and the sensory connections at that specific cortical column. I think I'll end it there. Um, yeah, it's because there's like if there's 150,000 kind of subcircuits and they're all different, hooked up to different sensors, and sometimes they're not even hooked up directly to sensors. Like our language, the Wernicke's and Broca's area are actually further downstream. They don't even get immediate sensory information. So the subcircuit that's hooked up to touch, you might have like, I know I'm going to learn, it's going to have some model of the way my phone feels. And my phone's going to make sounds, and the cortical columns that are hooked up to the sounds are also going to have an independent model. And the same thing with vision. And this last slide, which I didn't have time to go into, is these disparate models are ensembled by long-term connections in the brain. And that voting, successive voting and feedback, just encodes sets of probabilities of predictions. And through this feedback, they can suppress and come to agreement about what's actually being perceived across all these different models. And you get some intuition, if you take it seriously, into the binding problem and into split brain patients, which, along with Hubel and Wiesel, Robert Sperry won a Nobel Prize for doing these experiments, which don't make sense very much, yet again, with that old theory of cortical processing. That kind of reminds me of with this bird thing, right? Obviously, this is you could idealize it, and they did. They went and they knew this is a two-dimensional space, the experimenters, but they didn't tell anybody this. And they asked almost 30 of their participants afterwards, like, what were your strategies? And people had a whole bunch of myriad of strategies, but nobody reported of thinking of it as a 2D map. But how much easier might it have been if they showed the people that in the beginning?